Good afternoon and welcome to Inclusive Minds. Expertise by experience, I think is what we called it. I should know. I wrote the title, but anyway, there we go. So this is Alexandra Strick, who is the co-founder of Inclusive Minds, and I'm not going to waste their time by burbling on too much. Just to remind you that you have the capacity to donate. We're not donating to Seven Stories for this session. We are donating to Inclusive Minds, and the link is underneath the screen if you want to give them some money. They very much deserve it. What a superb organisation. I'm going to hand over to Alexandra and she can tell you more.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can people hear me? I hope you can. Somebody let me know if you can't. Brilliant. Right. Thank you for inviting us to be part of this brilliant conference. I've been watching it so far and absolutely loving it. I'm going to go straight to some slides, which I hope will work, and then I will tell you more. Bear with me for a moment. Right. Hopefully you should see a slide there with some details about me. So I'm going to talk to you today a few words about myself first, but then we're going to launch straight into the really exciting stuff. You'll have seen the session is called Experts by Experience, and it's all about how we at Inclusive Minds can help book creators to ensure authentic representation in children's books. So I'm going to tell you a lot about the Ambassador Network and a little bit about other things that Inclusive Minds does. And then, as I say, we're going to get onto the really interesting bit. We've got 3 real-life inclusion ambassadors here to meet you, to share some of their insights into their specific areas of lived experience, and to talk a bit about how they've actually applied their experience specifically to individual books. So you're very much going to hear about 3 different facets of diversity and some kind of top tips on how to develop authenticity in your own writing. We'll also talk a little bit about the Ambassador Service and even how to join it, just in case you're so inspired by these amazing ambassadors that you'd like to consider becoming one yourself. So first, just a couple of words about me. So I'm one of the 2 co-founders of Inclusive Minds, along with Beth Cox. My background is very much children's books, not surprisingly. For the last 25 years or more, I've worked in and around the industry. I've worked for and with book trusts, and I still do. I'm also one of the co-founders of Outside in World, which is the charity dedicated to books in translation, particularly exploring children's books in translation. And I also do a little bit of writing myself. And over my career, I've worked a lot with young people, directly with children and young people, particularly young disabled people, on projects that empower children and young people and really give them a voice. And I guess that's my absolute passion, is finding a way to make sure that young people have a real voice. In fact, anybody who needs it has a real voice, especially on and through children's books. So, Inclusive Minds. Beth Cox and I launched Inclusive Minds about 8 years ago in January 2013. And we started it as a rather woolly collective. So a kind of a way to bring together anyone with an interest in inclusivity in children's books like we had, and to form a kind of umbrella really for people to gather under, to campaign about the need, but also to really explore practical solutions and really take things forward rather than just talking about it. We found ourselves in great company under our umbrella from day one, including many wonderful authors, just a few here brandishing our logo. So Mallory Blackman and Julia Donaldson, you can see there, and Kerry Burnell and Philip Ardar and Catherine Johnson and Adair Depetan, but I'm just using this as an excuse to name drop really, aren't I? So I shall move on to what we've actually done since we've been in existence. So just a few examples. We run a regular event called A Place at the Table that some of you might be familiar with. It's really, again, an opportunity to bring people together, and mainly publishers, but also people from right across the book spectrum, to look at how we can address the challenges and move forward in really innovative ways. So that's a brilliant event that takes place every 18 to 20 months or so, although not surprisingly on a bit of a pause at the moment. We, a few years ago, developed an inclusion charter for the book industry and again for beyond the industry that anyone really can sign up to, organisations, publishers, schools, individuals. And this is a way of committing to specific actions that you're going to undertake and to shout about them as well. So you can see that logo there, we're inclusively minded, and we offer that to anybody who signs up to the charter to use to kind of tell the world that they're inclusively minded and to share their particular commitments about what they plan to do. We've offered a lot of consultancy and training, particularly to publishers, again, over the last few years. And we've been involved in all sorts of events, from things like London Book Fair to the various festivals like the Imagine Children's Book Festival. And we've developed all sorts of useful partnerships. So you can see some of the professional bodies that we work with most on the slide there. At the moment, we've got some lovely partnerships going with people. We're working on the Kate Greenaway and Carnegie Awards. So our ambassadors are feeding into that and helping the judging panel, which is really exciting. And we're also, some of my ambassadors are working with me with the Beano, which is a really fun project to be working on, helping them look at their long-term plans to improve inclusivity and diversity across the Beano comic and brand. And the project that I'm most excited about, not just saying that because they're here with me, it's of course our ambassador network. So I will come to that in just a few minutes. But I did just want to mention before I do that we very recently evolved from the rather nebulous woolly collective into a formal organisation. So we're now, hurrah, a community interest company, a real CIC with 3 amazing directors at the helm who themselves are ambassadors and have a wealth of lived experience, but also amazing experience and passion about improving inclusivity across the book world. So those directors are Heather Lacey, Jessie Parrott, and the author, A.M. Dasu. So if you want to find out more about all that and what we're doing and what they plan to do, you can read more about it on the website. Very important just to mention that Inclusive Minds is still very small. People think we're some big organisation because we've achieved a fair bit, but we're still very small, have no core funding. So most of what we do is voluntary, in fact, almost all of it. But we do achieve, I think, quite a lot of bang for our non-existent bucks. So on to the main meal. Network. So this is very much at the heart of everything we do at Inclusive Minds these days. And as you'll have gathered, it's a growing team of people with lived experience. And these are people who are willing to share that lived experience with book creators to help them improve authentic representation. We've got over 100 ambassadors, and that number's growing all the time. So they've got lived experience of a diverse range of identities, so huge knowledge between them of so many aspects of ethnicity, culture, disability, gender identity, you name it. And of course, crucially, they bring individual perspectives, loads of different perspectives on these things. There's no kind of one size fits all. One of the keys. And another key, I think, to the success of the network is in the fact that it's mutually beneficial. So it's very much about two-way benefits. It's valuable for the book creators. It's a way for them to, or for you, to connect with people who can really help, who have the knowledge to be able to improve authenticity in representation. But it's also, crucially, a way to give those individuals from diverse backgrounds and with diverse experiences an opportunity and a real say. And I think we always have to remember that when we're using, for want of a better word, the network. Another key point is that it doesn't aim to replace any other forms of research, but rather to complement them. It's a way of adding to your bank of knowledge about your book and about a particular character to make sure it's spot on. Also worth mentioning that to ensure maximum impact, we always try and get our ambassadors involved as early as possible in the process. Thankfully, we're seeing more and more requests to the network that are coming in at that early stage. So we're getting authors starting to contact us with an initial idea, just something they're contemplating, and we can even pair them up with an ambassador to talk in a very early stage. In fact, we've even had ambassadors proving to be the inspiration for a completely new book and then working with somebody to develop that book, which is great. Also worth mentioning that some of our ambassadors are authors themselves and aspiring authors, so they really do understand the challenges of writing. So what do they actually do before I pass you over to some of them? Well, I already mentioned they take part in events, and you can see some of our ambassadors, particularly actually some of our younger ambassadors there in those photos, I hope, on the slide. Good moment to mention that when we started the project, we very much called it Young Ambassadors for Inclusion. I wanted particularly to focus on involving children and young people and making sure that they had a voice, because, you know, children's books, and this is my soapbox moment, children's books are for children and should belong to children, so children should be at the heart of them. So we have a lot of young people in the group, but that said, as time's gone on, both the range of experiences and the range of ages of the ambassadors has really grown quite dramatically. We've now got a lot of professionals as ambassadors, so we've got a whole wealth of different ages and levels of, and types of experience. They do, just very briefly, they, as I said, help authors and publishers with accuracy and authenticity of content, and we'll go on to tell you how. Worth mentioning, they can help at various different stages as well. So they might be able to help you with an idea, as I said earlier, a manuscript, rough artwork, and they can even do things like offering comment on covers and blurbs and marketing material. We've had all that happen. But the key is, I think, to get them involved as early as possible as you can. Excuse my throat, got a bit of a cold at the moment. Very important to mention that the one thing there's not is sensitivity readers. So this isn't about checking a manuscript to remove anything remotely contentious. That's not what we're about at all. It's much, much more than that. We believe that lived experience should be embedded in a book, and at a far earlier stage. It's not about crossing things out to wrong, it's about making sure that all the right things are there. And if people come to us far too late in the process, it may be that only very, very small changes can be made, or sometimes changes can't be made at all. They might find a fundamental issue with the book that they feel is problematic, and of course, by that stage, it's often far too late to really change it. We're very flexible in terms of what we try and offer. We've evolved the network, and we try and make sure we can cater for any kind of needs and any budgets. The bulk of our users are still, I'd say, publishers, but we also do have some individual authors who use us. We know budgets can be small, aka non-existent sometimes, but we do ask that anyone using the service does pay some kind of fee to the ambassador, whatever the nature of the project. What can they offer you as a book creator, and how do you access them? Well, the website's there. In terms of what they can offer you, it might be, like I said, you just want a quick chat about an idea or a character, or maybe you've got lots of questions that you want to check to make sure that certain aspects of your book ring true. Maybe it's an ancillary character who's got a particular identity and you want help making sure that that's as convincing as possible. Or maybe it's actually a key theme or a protagonist that we're talking about, and you've got already lots of personal knowledge and experience, but you want to get a different perspective or several different perspectives, because you can involve many ambassadors if you want to, or several, and we can help there too. Maybe you've written the whole thing already and you want now a line-by-line analysis of what you've written. We can also help then. So our ambassadors, certainly somebody within the network, can probably help you, and a lot of our job is about pairing you up with the right person or people. Some of our ambassadors will just be able to share lovely little details. Others will be about supplying detailed reports and marked up manuscripts. So first request is to come to the website. As I said, there's a form there you can fill in, gives us all the basic information we need just to help us try and find the right person. And worth mentioning, you can also find out how to become an ambassador too there. Just a quick word, it's also worth thinking about how, if you haven't got a huge amount to offer in terms of fees, you can also still help an ambassador a lot depending on their particular interests. So they might actually benefit from experience and insight into the industry, references, acknowledgements in your book if you've both agreed that, and Inclusive Minds have agreed it as well, invitation to launch events where these things actually happen, or virtual launch events, free books. There's loads of ways to thank them alongside with a fee, however modest that fee is. So again, just in summary, how you use the network, how you access us. So I say you can go to the website. What happens next is, once you've filled out the form, We then we pull out the key information from that request that you sent us. We remove any individual names and specifics about books and things, and we just send a general ask out to our network, sometimes targeting people that we think will be particularly useful or relevant, but also opening it up to all the network to comment on. They come back to us to say whether they'd be interested and how they can help. We then collate that information. We would pass it back to you, and you can decide who you want to go ahead with, and then we connect you. We at Inclusive Minds stay involved in monitoring the project and making sure everyone's happy. We also invoice you directly an agreed fee, and that fee comprises just a modest connection fee and administration fee for us to fund the network, but the rest goes straight to the ambassador. And the pricing is all very transparent. There's a kind of basic menu of options on our website, but we can be very flexible because we do know, as I say, budgets can be tricky, and we can offer bespoke options too. So do have a look at the website after this session and look at how you might be able to use the network, or even become an ambassador, or maybe you know someone else who you think might benefit from becoming an inclusion ambassador. In summary, I think it's an amazing way to support the book industry, but also to give people opportunities and real voices. And it's having a real impact. We can see a change in books that are coming out. We can see huge changes that our ambassadors have been able to make with their incredible input by being experts by experience. So what sort of input can they give? Well, very glad you asked that, because we've got 3 people who can tell you. So we've got 3 ambassadors with very, very different experiences who you're now going to meet. Full bios are on the conference website, so do read more about them, but I'm just going to tell you very, very briefly about the 3 of them before I hand over. I'm going to do it in reverse order. So at the end of the session, you're going to hear from Jo. Jo is a very experienced ambassador for us. They are an autistic, non-binary, asexual, pan-grey romantic, polyamorous relationship anarchist who joined the network in 2018, and they're going to share all kinds of experiences and information and some really good top tips for you. Before that, you'll hear from Guntus, who joined the network about a year ago, but she's already provided input on a number of book projects for us very successfully. She came to the UK from India to study at UCL, and she's got experience of several different cultures, and she speaks 3 different languages and has lots of interesting material to share with you. But first, you're going to hear from Louise, who I'm going to ask to hand over to now. So Louise joined the network very recently, actually, with her daughter. And together with the family, they've got a wealth of experience. And she's got a huge amount of experience around the autistic spectrum, including ADHD and mental health issues. But Louise is also a huge advocate for neurodiversity in books and is an author herself. So let's see if we can pass over to Louise now. Just going to close mine down, Louise. Bear with me.
It's fine.
Right, I think
hello,
that's
everybody. Hopefully everyone can bear with me as I upload my my presentation as well now. 1 second. I'm waiting for yours to shut down, I think. Yours is still running. Alex. I think Alex's is still running, so hopefully I can upload mine. So here we go. Da da da. We wiggle our fingers. There we go. Hopefully, is it up? It's up. Okay, so hello everyone. I am Louise Gooding. I am the debut author of Just Like Me, which comes out March the 11th now. I just heard it's been moved forward a week. I am neurodivergent. I have ADHD. I'm also the mother to 3 kids, all of who are either neurodivergent themselves or have lived with chronic pain. We moved from England to Switzerland 9 years ago, so we've had to adapt to the new changes and challenges that moving to a new country can bring. Cultural differences, behavioural differences, attitudes and tolerance levels. I was once a single mother. This is not my situation now, but I do know what it's like to be a young teenage mother living off benefits in the UK. I also know what it's like to live with depression and how it's not always as it's depicted by the media. Being an expert in masking my own feelings, I have in the past been known to present the person I think everyone wants to see, bubbly, upbeat and full of energy, rather than someone who may be desperate for help but doesn't want to be a bother or burden to anyone. This introduction is to highlight the different areas that I have offered to help lend my experience to as an ambassador. I don't see any of these experiences as bad either. They just are part of my journey. And at the end of the day, all things that make up who I am now. My main focus for this conversation today is my experience with being neurodivergent and how that experience helps the Inclusive Minds Ambassador Programme. What does neurodivergent mean? I'm going to quickly explain my understanding of neurodiversity before we go on, so you can understand some of the terminology. We are all neurodiverse. Our brains are highly diverse in the way they function, work, and think. Neurodiverse is a broad term that basically covers everyone. It is often the term used when discussing autistic people, those with ADHD, Tourette's, etc. Neurodiverse is usually referred to as a group when we're talking about it as a group. If we break down neurodiversity into separate categories, we are better using neurodivergent and neurotypical. Neurotypical being someone who has had typical developmental and cognitive abilities. You may have also heard this referred to as normal. And I just need to clarify here and really make this point. This is not normal. Everyone has their own experiences which are normal to them. ADHD is my normal and your normal will be yours. So this is not a term that is encouraged when discussing neurodiversity. Neurodivergent covers the autistic spectrum, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's, and other. Peoples whose brains are maybe wired a little differently, as we like to put it in my family. People whose brains function in a way that is unique to them. It's also used to refer to as an individual. So if you're talking about someone who's neurodivergent, we are going to use neurodivergent, not neurodiverse. Recently, I used this knowledge to help as an ambassador with a read through of an amazing book that's coming out later this year. The author had referred to herself as neurodiverse. When reading this chapter, it was clear that the author had probably wanted to use neurodivergent as they were referring to their autism. I was able to include this in my feedback to the publisher and to the author and suggest this possible change. One thing I always try and note when communicating with the Inclusive Minds Network, the authors and the publishers, is that I appreciate my experiences are my own. So any feedback I offer is still subjective and always sensitive that there are many different lived experiences of being neurodivergent. So my experience of being a neurodivergent person will almost certainly be different to the next neurodivergence because there's such a huge neurodivergent spectrum. I'm almost certainly not an expert either on the subject. We will differ in our upbringings, our social experiences, the support or maybe lack of we have had access to, and so on. I grew up undiagnosed. I was a busy, loud, seemingly chaotic human who was quite aware something was not quite right. And later came the diagnosis and a realization that my life would have probably been much easier had I known I had ADHD. I know what it's like to feel different, to be seen as different, to have people be wary of me. I'm also aware of the knock-on effect this has on my mental health. As a mother, I've supported my children with their own diagnoses. I have been to numerous school meetings, asked for more support and help. I have to champion them every day and help them see their potential, even when others don't see it and they begin to question it themselves. I know how hard this journey is myself from my own experience, and I now see it again as a mother. When doing my read-through of the book I mentioned above, I read many passages aloud to my autistic daughter. Beyond my own insight and knowledge, I knew I could only offer some neurodivergent experience, and that of being a mother to an autistic child. But she was the one who was closest to the subject matter, and it was important for me to include her input too, and make sure that got back to the author. When it comes to Inclusive Minds, my family is kind of a package deal for the Ambassador Programme. I have my experience, I have my children's experience, and we tend to work together. My own book features people with disabilities or disabled people. Disabilities I have no lived experience with. And I think this is an important point to highlight here. Just because I wrote a book about disabilities doesn't mean I have the right to lend my opinion on how someone may portray a disabled protagonist. I'm not going to help a writer if I apply to be an ambassador for their project, if I'm just lending my opinion as a nice person with good intentions. I cannot fairly or authentically comment unless I have real lived experience, whether that's with disability, LGBTQIA+, cultural differences, background, religion, if I'm a person of colour, etc. Actual lived experiences are what really matter and are going to make a huge difference to the ambassador network and to helping get these books to the place they need to be. I apologise on this next slide. There may be some triggering words for some people out there. We all know the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And we all know this is utter nonsense. Words can have an immensely huge effect on people. And why I, as a neurodivergent person, may feel comfortable calling myself weird or a bit of an oddball is completely different when someone else calls me this or chooses to refer to another this way just because they're different. This is maybe a strong argument as to why own voice representation is so important and necessary when dealing with marginalised voices. Choosing to include words that reinforce negative stereotypes and negative tropes is not helpful in creating positive representation. Stereotypes may already be held by people picking up your books. If you're not presenting an authentic story, you're choosing to include words with negative connotations, you could end up being part of the problem. I once had a conversation with a lady who told me she had assumed that Horrid Henry had ADHD. She even went as far to say that she had told her kids that the reason for Henry's behaviour was probably down to this too. This lady wasn't trying to be malicious, she didn't have any ill intent, but yes, she was being very ignorant. There is literally no mention of ADHD in the Horrid Henry books, but yet with her own ill-informed prejudices and assumptions, she decided on her own accord to label Henry. Well, why? Henry was loud, mischievous, spontaneous. He was always getting into trouble and never thinking about the consequences, all of which are negative stereotypes and not a whole nor realistic understanding of ADHD. Henry is just horrid. That's just it. And if this is how people are judging characters with ill-informed facts about different traits or disabilities, isn't this the red flag we need to raise and push for better authentic representation, if not just to educate and spread awareness and empathy? Imagine being that neurodivergent kid picking up that book and seeing that this is someone else's portrayal of someone like them. If Henry is horrid, what does that make me? So when we address neurodivergent characters, how are you making sure you incorporate positive characteristics? If you are considering writing a neurodivergent protagonist, can you list more positive attributes than negative? And how long did it take you to think about it? And if you really had to think about it, are you even the right person or in the right position to start taking on that responsibility? As an author, you are in a magical place where you have the power to lift someone up and make them feel seen, but you also have the power to tear someone down. Seeing positive, authentic representations, a character a child feels they can connect with, can boost their self-esteem, their self-worth and confidence. It can connect your characters on much deeper level, personal level, and make them feel seen, worthy, and celebrated. So, I love this quote. I'm totally honest. I told the others I found this yesterday and added it quickly to my presentation, so I've not done the research as a non-fiction author. That's really bad. But whether Pablo Picasso said it or someone else, I like this quote. There is only one way to look at things until someone shows us how to look at them with different eyes. And I think this is such a great quote that really sings to the Inclusive Minds Ambassador Programme. Points to consider when applying to be an ambassador. Is my input valid? Well, yes, your input is valid, is very valid from personal lived experiences, definitely so. Does it add anything? Are you applying because you want there to be better, more authentic representation across the board in children's books and help lift marginalised voices? If yes, are you the right person to volunteer? Is your voice one of these marginalised voices? Then yes, you are adding your wealth and experience and knowledge. Do I have this relevant experience? Well, ambassadors can be kids who just want to see more books out there featuring people just like them. You could be a family unit like mine with your own unique voices and experiences, or you could be an industry professional or someone who strives for diversity and inclusion for a living. Everyone is welcome. There is literally a place at the table for all. So research, going back to this one, as it was mentioned earlier, you can't rely on this program to fill in all the gaps. You have to still do your own research. It goes without saying that lived experience is the best experience when it comes to writing authentic stories. I know my world best. I know how ADHD makes me feel and act. I know the conversations I have with myself, the accommodations I have to make for myself and others. I also know that my experience will ultimately probably be unique to me. There is no one way of having ADHD. It's, again, its own spectrum. Even though I am a neurodivergent person, it doesn't mean I know it all. If I write a book featuring a protagonist with ADHD, I still want to consider being respectful and thoughtful towards others with ADHD too. As I mentioned, there are so many different forms of ADHD. The author of the book I did a read-through for is autistic. She was aware that while she was obviously writing a book on her own experiences and journey, she was still writing a book on autism, and she wanted to be mindful of others in the autistic community. And that's why she and her publishers contacted the team at Inclusive Minds. If you don't have the lived experience of something and you're considering being inclusive of neurodivergent characters, maybe first ask yourself why. Do you know someone who is neurodivergent? Have you spoke to them about your thoughts? Have you done your research? Are you doing this because you feel you ought to? You want to be inclusive? And if you do decide to undertake this task, are you committed to the level of research you may need to do to portray your character in a true and authentic light? Now, don't forget you can consult the Inclusive Minds at any stage and any time to speak about your projects, or be put in touch with the ambassadors who may be able to guide you and get your book from a good book to a great book. So that's me. Hopefully now I can have Gunther join me, who's going to do the next part. Hopefully you heard that. Okay, I shall leave you to it.
Thank you, Louise. That was wonderful and so information as well. Just give me a second as I share my PowerPoint presentation with you. All right, hopefully that's up and running now. Hi, everybody. This is Guntas. I am trilingual. I was born and brought up in India. I came to the UK in 2019 for my master's degree. I am a self-published author, editor, and literary consultant. My sister and I write together. We want to break the prejudice in the publishing industry in regards to writers sticking to the genres or writing styles. We are currently working on our third project, which we intend to get traditionally published. Last September, with an MA in publishing, I joined UCL. Through uni, I signed up to volunteer at A Place at the Table, hosted by Inclusive Minds. That's how I got introduced to them. There I met Alex and Beth in person for the first time. Soon after, I got the opportunity to shadow and Kate Creamy Awards as an inclusion ambassador, and got introduced to the team and Inclusive Minds, work culture. It was such a enriching experience, and definitely was a factor in me choosing to base my dissertation on representation, inclusion, and diversity in children's books in the UK. I don't write children's books, but I do love reading them, and I'm so grateful to be able to have given creative input for a handful of them over the past few months through Inclusive Minds. The areas that I've fed into so far have been from a South Asian, Indian, Sikh Punjabi standpoint. So basically in terms of ethnicity, nationality, and religion. So my positionality in that regard is both of an insider and an outsider. It is so interesting to connect and communicate with people who write for children and require creative input from somebody with lived experience to make the titles more authentic and accurate. And also to be able to lend a hand in the creation of literature that I or others from my ethnicity and nationality have felt a dearth of growing up. So thinking from the point of view of a creator as well as a consumer, when I give feedback, which comprises of a detailed formal written report, followed by informal discussions via email. And although there is obviously no one right way of representing a community, but when somebody with lived experience is a part of the creative team, it certainly affords the characters, the setting, and the story in general greater reliability, detail, and depth. It also vastly reduces the chances of misrepresentation, cultural appropriation, and tokenism. We've always given guidelines as to which aspects of the book we're supposed to provide feedback on, but the added advantage of choosing to take a consultant on board is that, as is often in my case, we might end up giving advice on aspects of the book that you might not have even considered before. For instance, for one of the titles that I had consulted on, the creators had asked for my input from the get-go. They were open to me providing feedback on all aspects of the project. So I ended up pointing out that uh, how the attires of one of the characters does not quite match her faith, or that such traditional outfits are normally worn only on special occasions, how certain words have religious associations and therefore must be employed with caution, how aspects of one's culture can be organically added to the text without it seeming out of place. So it goes beyond just a basic filtering of offensive material. There has been a growing concern in the UK that a very small percentage of trade literature published in the UK contains characters, backdrops, and plots representative of the BAME community. This is essentially where the mirrors and windows discussion comes in. In order for children to feel like their identities, their lives hold value, they need to see it represented in mass media, in popular literature, in widely circulated and easily accessible trade books, as well as in niche and experimental literature. Trade books can help undo the narrow image creation of ethnic minorities by pop culture through positive reinforcement. Authentic and accurate portrayal of a community can help combat deeply ingrained stereotypes and internalized prejudices. Another point to focus on in this regard is intersectionality. So, one of the things that I focus on while providing consultation is whether there's diversity within diversity. So, are the creators only showcasing those elements of the marginalized section of the society that are already found in popular literature? Are they still relevant? Will the children and youth of today find them relatable? This brings me to the final section of my talk. So, swiftly moving on to the last slide now. Over the past 4 months, I have been extremely lucky to have worked on 5 individual projects as an inclusion ambassador. When the first project was advertised and circulated in the Young Ambassador Network, I decided to apply for it. I believe for the majority of the rest, I was specifically contacted for, which is the best kind of validation. One of them was for the Beano Studios and the rest for Penguin Random House. So far, I have provided consultation on both illustrations and text, mainly focused on artworks, with the following range of checks and points of input: historical accuracy and fact-checking, attires and accessories, detailed input on ancestries and heritage, religions, customs, traditions, festivals and lifestyles, regions and landscapes, racism and colorism within my own community, and how to ensure that these malpractices are not propagated through literature, and diversity in features and body types, vocabulary and sentence formation, target markets. Are they targeting readers in the UK or in South Asia? So what we do is beyond just providing a sensitivity read, like Alex said, it's going above and beyond mere screening of offensive and misrepresented text and illustrations. We provide highly valuable creative input too, to make the titles more realistic, detailed, and intersectionally diverse. So the sooner we're contacted, the better it is. We can then offer consultancy in many stages, as I often do. It saves the authors, illustrators, and editors a lot of time and ensures that there's room for big changes. And like I mentioned before, it enables me to be able to suggest and to present those facets of the minority communities that I'm representing that are not often voiced in pop culture or in pop literature. It also ensures that titles give the represented communities enough space and that they don't appear to be perpetuating tokenism. And that's all from me. Joe will be taking it from here.
Okay. Hi there, everyone. Sorry, just getting my PowerPoint into position. Okay, so hi, my name is Joe. My pronouns are they, them, and today I'm going to be following on from those by showing some examples of the ways that we can give detailed feedback on ways to improve writing. So in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on LGBTQIA+ content in, well, pretty much any content for young people. There are a few content notes. We've got discussion of systemic anti-LGBTQIA+ discrimination, mentions of intersectional issues, including racism, brief mentions of mental health problems, self-harm and suicide, and brief mentions of hate crime. So the reason I use the LGBTQIA+ acronym is because it's the best option available in most circumstances. It explicitly includes queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, aromantic, and agender people. And the plus sign indicates the diverse range of additional identities that are associated with the community. I want to talk a little bit about normative attitudes, Bowdlerization, and how they hurt LGBTQIA+ people. So, normativity is an assumption that something is the default, preferred, or normal way to be. Cisnormativity is the assumption that all people are or should be cisgender, which means they should identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. Heteronormativity is the assumption that all people are or should be heterosexual and heteroromantic, or straight. Amatonormativity is the assumption that a traditional view of a romantic relationship, being a monogamous relationship where the parties live together and have children, is the highest form of satisfaction that one can achieve in life, and that all people strive for or should strive for this kind of relationship. So, Bowdlerization generally involves the editing of language and sexual themes from an existing work in order to pacify the people funding, distributing, or authorizing the work, and/or to pacify a real or imagined bigoted audience, which is often euphemized as conservative. Specifically when it comes to LGBTQIA+ people, Bowdlerization means removing content about us from existing works simply because it is LGBTQIA+. This form of Bowdlerization subtly reinforces bigotry in the forms of cis, hetero, and amatonormativity and anti-intersex sentiment. So, in one manuscript that I fed back on as an inclusion ambassador, the bi female protagonist was dating a man, but realized that she's in love with a woman. She decided that she had to end the relationship with the man, even though it was going very well and is mutually beneficial. And no mention is made of even the possibility of polyamorous relationships, not even just to rule that out by establishing that the protagonist happens to be monogamous. This is a form of Bowdlerization and mononormativity. She also describes her romantic feelings for the woman as more than friends, as opposed to other than friendship, which is a case of putting the hierarchy of romantic relationships above non-romantic ones. So another key concept is stories as mirrors and windows. This is often used by teachers. So mirrors are texts in which children can find themselves, their families and communities reflected and valued. When students read books and see there are characters like themselves who are valued in the world, they'll feel a sense of belonging. And windows help us to develop understandings about the wider world. For some children, this might be the first time they're exposed to differences in culture, skin color, religion, and lifestyle. So it's important that their introduction is one of non-judgment and acceptance. But bowdlerization still has a lot of ongoing impact today. The American Library Association notes that the majority of the top 11 books that were challenged, banned, or relocated within libraries, schools, and universities in 2018 have LGBTQIA+ themes. School libraries often have an extremely limited range of LGBTQIA+ content, sometimes having none at all. For me personally, I spent a lot of time in my high school library, and yet there were only 2 books I found there with an LGBTQIA+ character. In both cases, it was a heavily stereotyped cis gay male. Nobody like me was represented at all. So when you live in a world without mirrors or windows, it's not surprising that LGBTQIA+ younger people and gender non-conforming young people are more likely to feel isolated because of their identities or other people's assumptions about them. Without mirrors, it feels like you're alone in your struggles and that you're a freak whose experiences should never be discussed. And this is made worse when you don't even have a name for your experiences. Without windows, there's no template for visualizing a happier life for yourself. There's only however your experiences have been so far. So given this, it's no wonder that mental health problems, self-harm, and suicidality are such major challenges for LGBTQIA+ and gender non-conforming young people. Fortunately, there are things you can do to help with that. So I'm going to give you some tips about ways you can make your work more inclusive and authentic. Sorry. First, think about the messages that your work sends. Does your world building account for the existence of LGBTQIA+ people? If characters in your work express normative or bigoted attitudes, are these viewpoints challenged and shown to be wrong or harmful? Does your work do anything to actively challenge the concepts of heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and amatonormativity? As a footnote, if you haven't got any LGBTQIA+ characters in your world at all, that has failed that check. Have you proactively checked for pitfalls regarding common harmful tropes and stereotypes? Because unfortunately, it's not enough to have a character be out to the audience as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. There's also the challenge of avoiding common unhelpful tropes that mainstream media has normalized about characters. This can be harder than you might think too, because everyone has unconscious bias as a result of the cultures and societies that they live in and the content they consume. So it's really easy to internalize some of those tropes or not realize that they're harmful. I'm going to walk you through some of the most common ones. So, assumed heteronormativity and cisnormativity, when a character is assumed to be straight and cisgender until proven otherwise. Erasure. If LGBTQIA+ people are mentioned, we disappear. You might think of being bumped off early in a horror movie, for example. Sexualization. The idea that sex is the sum total of LGBTQ+ people's identities, and that all we think about or do involves sex. Criminality, evil, and decay. Associating LGBTQIA+ people by definition with one or more of these undesirable traits. A similar association is sometimes made between Black people in these same traits. Finally, dehumanization and othering. Only portraying LGBTQIA+ coded characters as non-human and or incompatible with mainstream society, rather than as part of it. So if you only take one thing away from this presentation, I urge you to go read the TV Tropes resource. It's got a homophobia index where it goes through all of the different tropes that are associated with very flawed portrayals of LGBTQIA+ characters. And it's really worth the time. I have sent out the presentation to everybody who registered to attend, and if you're needing a copy, you can ask Golden Egg Academy to forward one on to you. So another text that I worked on at Inclusive Minds was by an author whose previous works had included supportive attitudes towards gay and lesbian characters. Clearly not somebody who was out to push their anti-LGBTQIA+ agenda. But in this text, no LGBTQIA+ characters were present or mentioned. There were frequent casual heteronormative statements that went unchallenged. The protagonist had no interest in boys, but assumed she would gain it at some point. Characters frequently assumed the genders and pronouns of the people that they met and heavily gendered them. And substantial gender stereotypes were also present. So as you can see, even people with the best intentions will still miss a lot. I also wanted to cover a few bad tropes specific to trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming characters so that you can know what to avoid. Misgendering, if it's going to happen in the narrative, make sure it's portrayed as a bad thing and not somebody having a difference of opinion. Dead naming, it's really better to preserve the character's privacy by never doing this. And if you're going to do it, consider ways that you can keep that information still secret from the reader. For example, by telling instead of showing. So she dead named me rather than having the character say the thing in a dialogue, or by using something like asterisks to block out the content of the actual dead name. There's often an undue focus on physical transition, which can tie in with fetishization and binary gender stereotyping, like, oh, she must always have been a girl because she liked playing with Barbies. That's not a helpful thing to do. And non-binary stereotypes are a more recent addition, but still very much a thing. People like me are very rarely portrayed as human. Robots, aliens, and mythical creatures are sadly much more common at the moment. And when we are portrayed as human, it's almost always a thin, light-skinned, androgynous character with a very neutral body type, in that they don't have very broad shoulders or hips, and their voices are usually pitched between high and deep for neutrality. So some tips for creating trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming characters. If you must feature gender essentialism in a narrative, don't leave it unchallenged. It's dangerous to readers' well-being to do so. Please don't create stories about transitioning unless you have lived experience of transitioning. And if a publisher offers to pay you to do this, please say no and ask them to find an own voices writer or illustrator to pay instead. However, please do create stories where transitioning is part of the wider narratives. There are many ways to do this. For example, in a character's backstory, as an additional part of a character's story arc, but not the core part, and by including transition methods and attitudes toward them in your world building. So, my last case study is a book where a cis person tried to write a story that was entirely about transition and transphobia. Unfortunately, they had a lack of essential knowledge or even research for authenticity. Dead naming was present in the story. There was a disproportionate focus on surgeries and hormone replacement therapy, and the transphobic character in the narrative only treated her trans relative with basic respect after learning about his history of self-harm and suicidality. So, some more tips for portraying LGBTQIA+ characters. If you've never come out, please don't write a story that centers on doing so. And it's important to remember that coming out is a lifelong process, not a one-off event. Characters can totally come out to themselves or other characters over the course of their stories, but stories where that's the core of the narrative should be left to own voice as creators. Focus on the character as a multifaceted individual. Make sure they feel like a real person, not a stereotype or a 2D cutout. And consider whether your setting features anti-LGBTQIA+ discrimination. If it does, how has this affected your character's attitude and behavior? When it comes to visual representation, the key concept is diversity. We can be from any background, have any skin tone, be of any size, have any disability. Some LGBTQIA+ people embrace a stereotypically queer aesthetic, while some of us are regularly mistaken for perisex, cis, straight people due to how we present ourselves, and others only adopt subtle cues. When it comes to relationships, if you can write an interesting, engaging dynamic for a relationship between perisex, cis, straight characters, you can do it for LGBTQIA+ ones. I recommend spending some time learning about aspec people's experiences, learning about diverse relationship models, such as queer platonic relationships, relationship anarchy, and polyamory. And when you're writing about a relationship, you can help to tackle rape culture by demonstrating a strong understanding of the need for informed, enthusiastic consent in your work. And this doesn't just go for sex, it goes for all kinds of boundaries, including touch and social interaction in general. Also, be aware of intersectional topics. Systemic discrimination against LGBTQIA+ people leads to a higher prevalence of mental health problems, unemployment, and homelessness. Also, be aware of racism and colorism. There are lots of LGBTQIA+ people of color out there, and they're vastly underrepresented. Be particularly aware of the disproportionate violent hate crime directed towards Black trans women and Black gender non-conforming people, especially sex workers. And also remember that LGBTQIA plus people's opinions on religion will vary. There are people of all faiths and none in the community. Some find religion a positive part of their lives, while others have been traumatized by religious bigotry. When you're creating content, there are a few ways you can practice allyship. First of all, educate yourself. Have your LGBTQIA plus characters show, discuss, and name their identities in canon. Don't be like the famous transphobe J.K. Rowling and try to add it as metatextual information, because that just doesn't work. Also, don't portray anti-LGBTQIA plus bigotry without challenging it and showing that it's wrong. And whenever you're portraying a marginalized group that you don't belong to, I would always advise hiring a consultant and paying them fairly. When you're getting an authenticity check, be as specific as possible. Saying, I need someone to check LGBTQIA plus representation in this novel means we don't know which specific identity or identities you need covered. Separate out different characters. So saying, I need to check authenticity for a trans lesbian and an asexual cis man is a lot more helpful than a combined list like trans, cis, asexual, lesbian man. Also, mention intersectional details. Is the character part of any other marginalized groups? Are they Black, Indigenous, a person of color, disabled, neurodivergent, working class? You can also hand in any other relevant background to help us out. So, for example, if your setting is a historical alternate universe without any anti-LGBTQIA plus bigotry, or if it's an oppressive dystopia with lots of nasty policies and violence, or if it's real world. Also, in daily life, a few ways you can practice allyship include sharing your pronouns, whether that's on a badge, in a username, conversation, social media bios, email signatures. You can also keep up to date with LGBTQIA plus organizations, activists, and content creators online. I've included a bunch of links in the presentation to help you get started. And you can support LGBTQIA plus activism, sign petitions, attend rallies, and so on. So, does anyone have any questions for all of us?
Right. Joe, do you want to stop sharing your screen and then maybe we can all come up as sort of big people?
Sure.
Brilliant. So let's put everybody up. Oh no, that's not going to work. That's just swapping. If everybody puts themselves up big, does that bring everybody up?
I don't think I have
your
a setting
head.
for that.
Do you not have a?
Don't think so. We can hover and see what
Okay,
questions
well, I'll bring you up.
if you like.
Yes. Okay, so we've got 22 questions, and there seems to be quite a kind of common theme going through them, and it's to do with this conflict between own voice narrative and tokenism, and getting that balance somewhere in the middle where we want to be reflective and not leave, we want to be diverse in our writing. We don't want to step on toes by taking over what should be an own voice narrative. And we don't want to go too far the other way and be accused of tokenism. How do we get it right, basically? And that is the kind of key thing that I think is encapsulated in a number of the questions.
I mean, from Inclusive Minds' point of view, I think I'd say that our concern is that the landscape is kind of skewed that we're seeing in books, and so it's not being tokenistic to redress that. We need to see all books being more naturally representative of society as it actually is. So that means we need everybody to reflect the real world and not to create images and storylines which leave out certain people. But equally, we need people with own voices who have the experience to across different experiences on a much more substantial level, if that makes sense. So I think you need both.
So a secondary character or even a minor character, as long as the research has been done and the representation is accurate and positive and adds something to the reader's knowledge and understanding of that character's experience, it's not tokenism. But if you focus your entire novel around a character that you have no lived experience of, then you're probably taking an own voice narrative where you shouldn't. Because I think it's fair to say that, if you haven't transitioned, if you haven't had to come out, if you don't have a disability, if you haven't lived with some form of racism because you come from a different religion, you have a different skin colour, whatever, you can't possibly know how that feels. And if you can't feel it, then it's not your story to tell. But you can tell it in a minor way as part of another story. Is that basically what?
I think so. I mean, I'll hand over to the ambassadors in a minute to comment, but I would say that if you're having to guess things, I think Louise touched on this, then you kind of know that there's something wrong. You know, you can't guess certain experiences. You can't guess what it's like to have transitioned. You can't kind of imagine that and try and express that. But you can reflect people within cast of characters to show that you're representing a diverse society. I don't know what any of the other amazing ambassadors think on that.
I mean, I could just say quickly, I mean, Joe and I have only met through doing this together, and we've had really great conversations where I've said something and Joe said, well, you know, actually, and I've gone, oh yes, sorry, you know, because I've got only my experience and I'm neurodiverse or neurodivergent, and so's Joe, but we're going to be completely different and have completely different experiences. And Joe won't know what I go through, I won't know what Joe goes through, and this is the sort of thing we're talking about. And so, you know, bringing my daughter in to a read through, I can empathize, I can understand a bit of the neurodivergent experience when it talks about autism, but I don't live it. It's not my day to day, and so I kind of have to make that check in. You know, I have to kind of make it relevant. And for me, it's something, you know, for everyone, I think here will have different thoughts and feelings on that. But I'm quite aware that I can only really, really speak for what I know. It would be, you know, unless I do all the research, and I appreciate there might be people here who say, okay, well, I've got a degree in this, and, you know, I've studied to do something. And it was, I think one of the questions came up of if I'm writing nonfiction. Nonfiction is slightly different because it is literally, it has to be fact-based. It has to be fact. But again, why are you thinking, I want to write a nonfiction based on ADHD? Is that your background? Do you know it? Is there a personal reason you want to do that? Because I think anyone, it's like, you know, me saying, goodness, I'm just going to write about your experience, but it's all going to be fact-based. Because I'm just going to spend hours on Google and read a few books. You might go, well, hold on, I've lived this, you know, and thank you for doing the research. But, you know, and we can still work together. That's the great thing. I mean, I could speak to her and we could form a relationship, as you said earlier. This is when two people get inspired by each other and can work together. That's slightly different. But if you're going it alone and you're not looking for the research and the extra help and the guidance to get you there, it's going to be slightly, you know, a different opinion. It maybe not be as good as you could get something to be. I'll stop now.
I'd just like to say to the audience that if you look at the questions that are in there, a number of them have been answered by members of the panel already in writing, so it's worth going and checking that, and you can do that when the session is finished. We are obviously already overrunning, but I don't want to stop yet, but I'm not going to ask the questions that have been fully answered in writing. And like I say, using this link, once the session is finished, give it 5 minutes, you can come back in using the same link, you can look at the questions, you can rewatch the whole thing, and you can look at all of the chat, including all the links and comments that have been put in there. So you have this as a resource, plus you've got the emailed stuff that I sent out last night, which is, I think it's only 3 out of 4 presentations, but it's 3 out of 4, and I think I'll try and get good answers to you later. So following on from that, somebody's asked about fantasy and the idea that because a lot of children's books are based in a sort of fantasy or fantasy realism type setting, and therefore diversity is reflected within a fantasy sort of way. So if you haven't got totally human characters, you might have fantastical disabilities or fantastical different ways of thinking. Is that useful in terms of undercutting prejudice and aiding understanding, or do you think that the jump isn't made between I don't know, Jar Jar Binks and maybe having some kind of neurodivergent condition? I mean, you were saying earlier about not making those assumptions with Horrid Henry. Is it very important to label and signpost and keep things within reality, within that framework?
I have strong opinions.
Okay.
So I think it's very important to, if you're going to code a character as belonging to a certain disability group, then it's important to give them that label. Also, the same goes for neurodivergent characters. So, for example, the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime was my first instance of seeing a character who behaved even slightly like me in a book. And yet it's really problematic within the autistic community because it wasn't particularly amazingly researched. It's not the most authentic thing in the world. And also, the first edition used the term Asperger's on the blurb, and I could go into a whole talk about why Asperger's is not a great term, but they then took that off subsequent editions and didn't use it because they didn't want to have the responsibility and accountability that came along with claiming to represent a group, especially when they knew they hadn't done a good enough job with it. So I think if you're going to do it, just put your hand up and say that you're doing it. Like, yes, this character is autistic. I've done my research. I've consulted my inclusion consultants. I'm happy to welcome any feedback from the community so I can improve in my future work. And when it comes to fantastic disability, so, for example, a Pegasus that can't fly. That's one that's from My Little Pony. It's genuinely in there. It's an interesting TV series. But the way that one was handled was problematic for me because the show didn't have, for a very long time, any non-fantastically disabled characters in it. There is very briefly in one of the later seasons a character who appears for about 10 seconds who has a sort of steampunk wheel frame for his hind legs because he's based on a competition winner, I believe it was. And so he has an assistive device. But the only other times that you see anything like a wheelchair in the show is if a character has sustained a temporary injury and they'll be back to being able-bodied in no time. So if you're going to have any kind of fantastic racism or fantastic disability or fantastic neurodivergence or whatever, then you need to be thinking about how you're portraying the real world variants that already exist. And one way you could not portray the real world variant is fantastic religion. Because if, for example, you're in the D&D universe and all of the gods are completely different to anything that we have here, it would be kind of strange to then go, yes, but have I included any real-world religious groups in this? Because that wouldn't make sense within the story itself. But what you should be checking in those cases are that your fantastic versions aren't just horrendous analogues for you to portray bad stereotypes about the real-world groups. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that was helpful. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, Mallory Blackman does it obviously with the Noughts and Crosses series, which is fundamentally about racism and about exclusion and in any way, but without mentioning race because they are Noughts and Crosses, which is very clever. But you're particularly right about representations of disability. There are very few books in which, if you engage with nature and stuff, you don't actually just miraculously become healed. And yeah, I could talk an awful lot about representations of disability in children's fiction and the lack thereof. I think we've covered an awful lot of the key points. I
was just going to quickly say, Jo, did you want to answer quickly? Someone mentioned about, using labels, and referring to them, because, again, I think you and I both could talk about this, but you're so well, so articulate and how best to put it.
Give me a moment to find the question, unless somebody wants to read it out to me.
Yeah, it was David Thorpe, I think, said, a name for your experiences. Yes, sure, that's affirmative and helpful. But as kids are changing and questioning, is there a conflict here with labelling? It's a really interesting point.
So no, there isn't, is the short version. So growing up as an asexual non-binary person, I didn't have terms for either of those parts of my identity. And instead, I was just not normal to my peers, which was incredibly harmful and damaging. The difference is, teaching people that they have to have a label is harmful. Teaching people that there are lots of different labels for diverse experiences and they can choose to adopt any that they find helpful is fine. And when it comes to things like representation of X group in a book, if you represent X group in the book, but you don't call them X group by name, you're basically writing yourself a get out of jail free card for if you mess up that representation and cause that group harm. And I don't think that's okay. So even if you have a character say something like, I identify with a lot of the same things that people who call themselves asexual do, but I don't like having labels like that. I just go by queer, or I don't do any labels whatsoever. Although, weirdly enough, queer is a label for not doing labels. But you can do something like that, or you can have two characters in a discussion where one of them has made a mistaken assumption about the other, like thinking that they must be cisgender or heterosexual, and the other simply saying, no, I'm not. And if they don't want to go into more detail as a character, that's fine, but you've then broken the assumption of normativity that would go along with that.
Yeah, it's about knowing what you don't know, isn't it? So if you don't know what you are and you're completely at sea, that's one experience. Whereas if you have a label or a series of labels that you can, like a colour chart, you can sort of match yourself to and go, well, it could be that or it could be that. Then you can start to create some kind of understanding of yourself and a language to describe it, and then how you describe it and whether you choose to label yourself or your character is a choice rather than something you just can't do because you don't know, because you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the language to do it.
Oh, I see somebody just asked about what about picture books, abstract approach, no labels. Have you ever seen a pride flag? Because there's an awful lot of abstract approaching in visuals that me and my LGBTQIA plus friendship group do with our use of color schemes that relate to our pride flags. So, for example, black, grey, white, purple is the asexual pride flag. And if you click on my Crowdcast profile, you'll see that my cover image is a series of clouds that happen to incorporate those colors. Oh, wait, but it's a subtle signal to everybody who knows what asexuality is. It's actually a secret pride flag. So there's a lot of ways that you can use just simple things like color to abstract elements like that into books. And also for picture books, obviously for a non-visible disability, yes, that's going to be harder to portray. But you can find ways around it if you're being creative. And for things like skin tone and visible disability, it's very straightforward, really. You just put people like that in your book.
And I think it's the age range, isn't it? If you're looking at picture books, labels maybe aren't relevant. That's something, maybe some of these things, a child hasn't maybe chosen, maybe they have chosen their gender identity, maybe they haven't, maybe they don't, they're just starting a journey where, I said I wasn't diagnosed until I was an adult, so there's all of these things to consider. As you said, there's subtle things that you can work in there. And also you have to, again, work out, like, what age group are you? Is it relevant to this age group? And I think lots of this, the sooner you can put things into books, the better. The more you normalize things. I said, my kids have had books on everything, and the fact that my daughter came up and said, "Mum, I finished all my LGBTQ IA books. Where have we got more?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, just just because they're there." And I didn't, I don't know if that means anything, don't know if it doesn't. And she was, very happy for me to ask on Twitter, which is an amazing resource for if you need book recommendations. But yeah, just the sooner you just put books out there, whether they're picture books and you're subtle, or whether you just don't need to be subtle and just, as Joe said, just put it there. It's colors, it's people, it's life, it's around them and it's around there. But just seeing how you're tweaking it, I guess. So yeah, picture books are a great start, but some of these actual terms we've talked about maybe then more relevant to maybe middle grade. But yeah, have a think and speak to inclusive minds, because they'll really help you put it into perspective.
It's about making sure that we're creating an image of the world that isn't white, middle class, able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual, heteronormative, and a lot of books still are very much so. So whatever we can do to reflect the world in all its amazing diversity, as writers, I think we need to do that. And the fact that Inclusive Minds are here to help and open the dialogue, because the dialogue is important, and own, as they said, own those labels, because even if you get it a little bit wrong, even after you've done your research and you open a dialogue on Twitter, okay, so you may take a bit of flack as a writer, but that flack in itself is helpful. It's getting the conversation going, it's bringing it into focus. So thank you ever so much to Inclusive Minds, and for staying late, and for everybody for staying late. It's been absolutely fascinating. And they don't forget to donate if you possibly can to such a fantastic organisation. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks everybody for listening. Been really interesting talking to you.